As I noted in a short I uploaded a few months ago, this year has been one full of extremely disappointing films. Now, a disappointing film is one thing when most audiences share your disappointment or are at least apathetic, but it's another entirely when everyone with anything to say about the film can't stop fawning over it. As I've already discussed in great depth, this was the case with James Gunn's Superman, but at least in that case, there was initially a quite vocal minority calling it out for what it was, and in the months since its release, the general consensus seems to have shifted to acknowledge its many flaws. Such was not the case with Paul Thomas Anderson's latest film, One Battle After Another. My only comfort with this one was that hardly anyone went to see it, but I've hardly heard anyone who has call it less than the greatest film of the decade, and I doubt I'll ever fully understand why. I will offer plenty of my thoughts and feelings on this film throughout this video, but as you could likely tell from the thumbnail, this isn't just a review of one movie. I could have made that video right after I saw the film, but I didn't, because it didn't seem worth making. Not that I can give you a particular reason for why I'm making this video now, other than that the way people reacted to and engaged with this film has stuck with me, particularly in comparison to the reception of the other film you saw in the thumbnail. Alex Garland's Civil War was my favorite film from last year, and it has continued to haunt me ever since I saw it. I've already made a whole video on why I love it so much, which you should definitely check out next, so I'll try not to make this one too redundant. But while I found it to be an extremely timely and resonant look at our society and warning about our future, it seems most audiences didn't get much out of it and promptly forgot about it. And this video is here to ask why this film was received with such apathy, while One Battle After Another was so eagerly embraced by its intended audience and hailed as such a timely masterpiece, and what that means for our society. But if you're new to the channel, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. And before we get any further, I want to make a couple of clarifications just to make sure I don't get any particularly stupid comments from anyone who's made it this far. For one, while I don't believe film criticism is entirely a matter of total subjectivity, or else I wouldn't find it worth talking about, I do fully admit that what resonates with me and thus makes for a worthwhile experience in a film is largely a matter of subjective experience. And thus, I understand that just because one film resonated with me and another didn't, that doesn't mean I'm invalidating the experiences of those who disagree with me. This video is merely attempting to explain why only one of these films resonated with me, and more importantly, why I find it concerning that one seemingly resonated with so many more people than the other. And for the other clarification, while both of these films are highly political in nature, and my comments here will largely be focused on their handling of political issues, my criticisms here are not motivated by my stances on any particular issues and whether or not I agree with the stances presented in the films. Had PTA's movie been about radical conservatives rather than radical progressives, I'd have largely the same things to say about it, though surely the conversation around it would be quite different, making this a very different video. So I don't want to hear any comments accusing me of disliking the film simply because I'm on the wrong side of the spectrum. Now with all that out of the way, let's dive into this not at all controversial video that definitely won't have an extremely toxic comment section. Let me start this section of the video by briefly repeating the thesis of my last video on Civil War. Alex Garland didn't make the film that most audiences were expecting, but I believe it was the film we needed. It doesn't get into specific political issues or even clarify which side of the titular conflict represents which real-world political faction. The main characters aren't soldiers or anyone with a personal stake in the struggle for America's future, but rather journalists just trying to get close to the violence to observe and record the atrocities being committed. It's a film far more interested in showcasing the effects of war, the inevitable results of hatred, fear, and division left unchecked, than it is in getting us invested in the conflict itself and making us root for a side. It avoids glorifying or dramatizing such a hypothetical scenario, or vilifying either side of the real political spectrum in favor of emphasizing the horror of such a potential future. Its message is one equally for progressives and conservatives, refusing to take sides in a conflict that is itself the villain of the movie. The film is only about politics insofar as it speaks to the state and trajectory of our political climate. Some might call it an apolitical film, but I'd prefer to call it an anti-political film. Some have argued that its lack of clear sides and its characters' lack of investment in the war itself gives the film a weak narrative, but I find such criticisms miss the filmmaker's point entirely. Besides, the narrative provides a fascinating exploration of how people respond to trauma through each of its unique protagonists. Understandably, the title of the film led many audiences to expect a narrative focused on the external conflict of the Civil War, but the real conflict of the story is internal, using this future war as the setting for this conflict, and arguably even the antagonist driving it. This isn't an epic war film, it's a road trip movie, at times a horror, and at its core, a character study. Lee responds to the horror she has witnessed with a stoic apathy, having become closed off and cynical after years of helplessly witnessing atrocities. Meanwhile, in Jessie, we see someone initially innocent to war, traumatized by it as she's thrust into it headlong, gradually becoming as numb to it as her mentor was at the start. Lee, in turn, softens over the course of the movie as she lets herself connect to this girl in whom she sees her younger self, coming to again value a human life over the story, a tragic and poignant reversal. Additionally, Joel has become addicted to the adrenaline rush that comes with the job. He has avoided letting the things he experiences affect him by choosing to find excitement in them rather than horror. And finally, Sammy seems to be the only experienced one who has not given up some part of his humanity in his career. Unlike his colleagues, he avoids the worst of the violence himself, though he's not afraid to put himself in harm's way for others. His sacrifice deeply affects everyone in the group, inspiring Lee to put saving others before her mission, shaking Joel's usual love of thrill with an atrocity deeply personal to him, and teaching Jessie to numb herself to loss. In these characters, we can all see how we respond to personal trauma, or simply to the horrors we see on the news all around us. Many of us become cynical and jaded to the state of the world, while others of us find a dark sort of entertainment in it. Frankly, I think Joel could easily represent the audience that expected more of an exciting action movie out of this film. However, if we don't wish to lose our humanity to this world of callous hatred, we can't stop valuing human life and let ourselves lose our connection with the people around us. All this to say that Civil War is a film that knows how to use a politically charged dystopian scenario that could have made for a deeply divisive film in the wrong hands, in such a way as to be able to speak with equal effectiveness to anyone of any political persuasion, depicting political violence in a sensitive, unbiased way that ought to horrify us all at the future our country is headed towards. One Battle After Another, by contrast, is the kind of film that seems designed to reveal the political leanings of anyone who reviews it. Whether you consider it a poignant and timely message for our society, or a pointless, tone-deaf, and obnoxious piece of partisan propaganda, is almost entirely dependent on whether or not you are predisposed to agree with its entire worldview and ideological paradigm. Whenever I would discuss the film with people after it came out, I would try my best to keep my thoughts and feelings as apolitical and divorced from my own opinions on the movie's themes as possible, but that's quite a difficult task when the story is fundamentally a political satire, almost exclusively mocking and vilifying one side of the spectrum. Before you can begin to get invested in the characters or the larger conflict of the story, the plot demands that you accept ultra-progressive positions on issues such as abortion and illegal immigration as moral absolutes and buy into this version of the world where our country is run by cartoonish caricatures of the rich, conservative, Christian white supremacists the far left likes to imagine are everywhere in positions of power. And while I hesitate to go so far as to claim that PTA is actively attempting to glorify political violence, he puts himself in a dangerous position by refusing to overtly condemn it. You could read the story as one of violent zealotry failing to make any real change and the next generation learning from the mistakes of their predecessors, as many viewers have claimed. But that would be purely projecting onto the actual text of the film, because there's no actual admission in the story that anything about the original revolutionaries' cause was misguided, or indication that Willa is going to do anything differently from them in the future as she becomes involved in the cause. With that said, I think many of this film's defenders do have a point when they argue that it isn't preaching a progressive ideology. It's actually not. The thing is, it doesn't need to, because it takes such an ideology for granted. The ideas the film actually wants to explore are more nuanced and personal than simple politics. But the story that wants to explore these ideas is entirely built on the foundation of such political ideologies. They are baked into every fiber of the story, without ever needing to be preached. This makes it a particularly interesting film to examine because relatively conservative audiences don't even necessarily have such strong feelings against it as they might against something more overtly preachy, but they simply can't begin to connect with it because it was clearly written to connect exclusively with an audience who would share the worldview it is built on. Meanwhile, The people who it was made for can't understand why anyone wouldn't connect with it because they just accept its ideological premise without thought or question and then move on to consider all the other elements of the film. So does this mean it's a good movie if you can just accept it on its terms? Well, perhaps I could see a version of this film for which that was the case, but as it is, I feel it relies far too heavily on the audience agreeing with the character's political cause to get them invested in their story. In the first 45 minutes before the time jump, the characters are hardly given any compelling personal development or motivation, nor are we given any reason to sympathize with their cause. They're just a bunch of horny, foul-mouthed terrorists getting themselves into trouble for half an hour before any sort of character conflict or meaningful plot kicks in to set up the actual story. And when the actual story does start, it's not bad, but by that point we're already a third of the way into the runtime and very much expected to already be invested in these characters. Had the movie either A, cut the first 45 minutes entirely and left the backstory as a mystery to be revealed to the audience as Willow learns it, or B, fully committed to its massive runtime and taken the time it needed to actually flesh out Bob as a character from the beginning, perhaps introducing us to the French 75 through his eyes by showing us how and why he got involved with them in the first place. Then maybe it would be easier to see this as a character-driven piece that happens to involve particular political themes, rather than a politically motivated piece that eventually gets around to including some mildly interesting character work once all but its most left-leaning audience is already thoroughly turned off. And while I said that the themes the film actually explores are more nuanced than the political issues it takes for granted, those themes are hard to appreciate when you can't get behind the characters or cause through which those themes are explored. The main themes the film's fans point to have to do with the variety of ways different people over time represent and fight for the same cause. But this is hard to really recognize or appreciate when you don't immediately agree with the cause for ideological reasons and aren't given good personal reasons to root for the characters fighting for it. And while most fans of the film find Perfidia a fascinatingly complex character, I just found her a horrible person since I wasn't naturally inclined to think she was fighting for a good cause. With all this said, I want to admit that I would probably connect with this film a bit more if I was more inclined to agree with the film's underlying ideological paradigm, so I'm not saying anything against those who do connect with this film. However, I like to think that I would still recognize the issue here even if I did more easily connect with it. And if you're still not sure what this issue is, then I think it's time to get into the reactions to these films. So going back to Civil War, Alex Garland's masterpiece went largely slept on. From what I can tell, it gathered a lot of buzz before its release and was fairly successful, but reviews were mixed and largely unenthusiastic, and it's been hard for me to find many people online giving it much attention. The general consensus from audiences appears to have been that it was an underwhelming experience with no apparent point. I already explained why I think people went in with the wrong expectations and came out missing the point, but what I didn't mention was that I also went in with the wrong expectations and wasn't initially sure what to make of it. However, its grim warning resonated with me so deeply that I couldn't stop thinking about it, and had to keep going back to it until I understood why. This film's message is, as I said, one that everyone living in our political landscape can and should appreciate. A plea not to succumb to the polarization that leads to such horrific atrocities as the ones shown in this film. But it seems most audiences, like the film's characters, were too apathetic to care. We're just too acclimated to the depravity around us to be affected by such a dark vision of the future. And frankly, I think many of us just don't want to hear what the film has to say. In fact, I've engaged in conversations about the film online in which many people said that a war like the one Alex Garland depicts is either inevitable or even necessary. On both sides of the spectrum, too many people are so consumed by fear and hate that they don't see any other way to fight for what they believe. Are we so resigned to our future that no such warnings will steer us from our path? Perhaps by the time such a warning as Garland's is believable enough to resonate, it's too late for anyone to care. PTA, on the other hand, doesn't seem all too interested in warning us away from his dystopian future. In fact, his story could very easily be read as a battle cry. It's unclear whether his film is supposed to be set in a war-torn near future or just a fictional version of the modern day, but regardless, the world he depicts is one at war. And based on the information with which we are presented in the film, that doesn't seem to be a bad thing. After all, the antagonists are all clearly evil, cartoonishly so at that, and we never see any particularly horrific consequences of the revolutionaries' actions, except for those which they bring upon themselves. If civil war used political violence to frighten us of our country's worst future, one battle after another seems totally resigned to that future, and doesn't hesitate to take a side in it. Both films use an exaggerated reflection of our society to make a point about it, but while Civil War's point is to ask us if this is what we want our world to become, one battle after another just points the finger at the bad guys. And while I've heard fans of the movie say it's not about good guys and bad guys, yeah, sure, they're all douchebags, but it's obvious who the real bad guys are. Sadly, of the two, it's the latter film that seems to be resonating with people. If Civil War was a warning for everyone that no one wanted to hear, then One Battle After Another is a war cry for one side of the spectrum, one that its intended audience is all too happy to heed. Like I said, PTA never explicitly preaches progressive ideals or definitively tells the audience that political violence is good, so it might seem unfair to call it propaganda. However, while it may not be as obvious or even as ill-intentioned as more preachy political films that put ideological issues front and center in the narrative, I find it to be a far more subtle and perhaps equally dangerous form of propaganda. One which forces you to buy into its worldview to care about its story, without needing to beat you over the head with its message. It may not be actively telling you to pick up a gun and take to the streets yourself, but like all good propaganda, it still vilifies the perceived enemy of its intended audience, reinforcing their black and white, us versus them political worldview. To be absolutely clear, I am not saying that white supremacist groups are not real, and I am certainly not saying that they aren't bad. What I am saying is that everyone in the film is either a liberal extremist or working for the satirized caricatures of how liberals imagine white supremacists, which makes it all too easy to see this world as one composed entirely of heroic freedom fighters on the left and irredeemable villains on the right. Now, if you can easily flip the political sides of a story, but not without entirely losing your audience, it's propaganda, and I can all but guarantee that if you were to make the French 75 religious extremists and make the villains a secret communist organization, the vast majority of the film's fans would reject it. Once again, I am not saying that there are no valuable universal themes to be gleaned from the film, or that all of its fans are just political zealots who love it only for its politics. Many of the people I've seen praise this film most strongly are far too intelligent and respectable for that to be the case. What I am saying is that I find it worrying how many people clearly connected with PTA's partisan political paradigm, compared to how few apparently found Alex Garland's warning against such partisanism nearly as harrowing as I believe we ought to. But what do you think? I hope that if you made it this far into the video, then you're not the kind of viewer to make a straw man of me to beat up in my comments, but please, let's make the discussion here civil. My favorite part of having this channel is getting to engage with you in my quest to better appreciate the art of storytelling, and more fully understand people, relationships, and society through the stories we tell. So if you did connect with PTA's latest film, please tell me why. You wouldn't be the first to try to explain why the film is so great, but no one has yet said anything that has helped me appreciate it more. And this video was largely driven by my attempt to understand why. But do you agree? Which film do you think is more resonant and timely for our society, and why? And do you find the receptions to these films as worrying as I do? I look forward to continuing the conversation with you down below, provided it's respectful. So until next time, just keep thinking out loud.